Chapter 12. Rue hesitated. She didn't like the boy, and she doubted very much that he had a coyote in his room. In the end, though, she gave in to her curiosity. The room was very large, and the drawn curtains made it dark, but Rue could see that it had the same long rectangular shape as the girls' dormitory. This must have been where the boy slept, Rue thought, and they also had a door that led to the body chute. This room was far more luxurious, though. The furniture was formal and heavy, with a large four-poster bed in one corner. There was a stone fireplace whose mantel held stacks of board games and books. The other end of the room was lined with shelves, and on the shelves were dozens of animal skeletons mounted on wooden blocks. "Working on the coyote," the boy said, pointing to a large skeleton that sat on a desk in the corner. It was propped up with metal posts and a wire, and there were bottles of glue and a small drill on the desk. The coyote was such a spindly thing. It seemed to be made up of birch branches bent to form a spine and legs and the most delicate toes imaginable. The skeleton tilted to one side as though it were limping, and Rue noticed that the bottom parts of its right hind leg was missing. "Are they real bones?" Rue asked, reaching towards one of the coyote's legs. "Don't touch." "Yes, of course they're real." The boy watched Rue as she walked around the room, examining the shells. There were birds, frogs, lizards, coiled snakes. She stopped at a skeleton with a long tail that was shaped like a conical seashell and what looked to be half a beehive covering its back. "Armadillo," the boy said. "Look at all the joints in the shell. That's how they can roll up in a ball. And that one there," he pointed to a long, squat skeleton with impossibly fine ribs and the head of a tiny dinosaur. "A Gila monster." She was tricky to put together. The coyote was easy. He ran his finger lightly over the coyote's front leg. "See how the elbows turn in and the feet turn out? That's so the legs can swing in a straight line. Makes them faster. But Violet snapped one of the metatarsals on its hind leg, so I'm waiting on a new one. What do you think?" "I think it's creepy," Rue said. "That's what Violet says, but it's not very different from doing a puzzle. When things are all in pieces, don't you want to put them together again?" "I do." He seemed more likable now, somehow, Rue thought. More like a regular boy. She looked at him carefully, taking in his bony shoulders, slightly curled in like an old man's, and the bruised purple shadows beneath his eyes. His wide jawline made it seem as if he were meant to be more substantial than he was. His lips were full, though dry and pale, and his hair was black and thick and wild-looking. "What's your name?" Rue asked. "Philip. What's yours?" "Rue. How come I've never seen you around the house before, or out by the water?" The question appeared to displease him. "I prefer my room." His tone grew cold and self-important again. It reminded Rue of his father. "I suppose you don't know how to play canasta?" "No." "You'll learn." He walked over to the fireplace and took 2 packs of cards from the top of the mantel. Then he sat down on his bed and stared at Rue, his back stiff and head held high, waiting. "Well?" he said, when Rue didn't move. "I never said I would play," Rue replied. "But I want you to play," Philip said, looking genuinely shocked, as if no one had ever denied him a thing in his entire life. "Then you had better ask me to nicely, not order me around like I'm your servant." Philip opened his mouth to say something, and from the look on his face it wasn't going to be anything polite, but then he shut his mouth again. After staring up at the ceiling for a moment, he looked back at Rue. "Please," he said stiffly. It was just short of civil, but Rue accepted it. The game was complicated and Rue had to focus, but she was a fast learner, and before long her thoughts began to wander back to the garden. "I'd better go," she said finally, laying down her cards. "But why?" Philip cried. "I have things to do." "What things?" he demanded, his voice growing sharp. "It's none of your business what I do," Rue retorted. "It is my business. It's my house." Then his anger turned to shrieks. "Don't go! Don't go! Don't go!" Until a door on the far side of the room was flung open and and in rushed Miss Valentine and Violet. At the sight of Rue, Miss Valentine's mouth popped open. She looked from Philip to Rue and back again, as if unable to convince herself that she was seeing them both together. "How did this happen?" she asked in a thin, horrified voice. Violet hurried past her and gripped Rue by the shoulder, quickly guiding her out of the door and shutting it. She turned to Rue, poised to scold. "Don't!" Rue warned her. "It doesn't matter anyway. You couldn't drag me back in there. I don't know how you stand him. I really don't. He's awful." "Not awful, Rue," Violet said. "He's just had a rough time of it. So have a lot of other people." "Like you?" Violet asked. "Well, you don't hear me screeching, do you?" Rue said. Philip's screams filled the hallway, interspersed with Miss Valentine's attempt to calm him down. "No, I don't," Violet agreed. "You suck it all in. You keep yourself as hard as a steel beam. Philip lets it rip, but in a few minutes he'll be done. He'll go limp, and I can hug him and wipe his eyes and cheer him up. Which is better? I don't know." "Anyway," said Rue, shaking this off, "why did you keep us a secret from each other? You lied to me when I asked about the humming." Violet sighed, blinked quickly, and glanced away. After a moment, she said, "Philip is strung tired as a fiddle. There's no denying he's lived a strange life, cooped up on this island with no other children around and his father gone so much. He adored his mother, and she adored him back. She was all he had, really, and they were always together, best friends. So when she died, well, it shattered the poor thing." Violet shook her head. "I've never seen a person grieve so hard. He just stays in his room all day, tinkering with those awful bones, growing more gloomy and sullen. He barely eats a thing. He's just wasting away. We thought it might help him if he had friends, so this past summer Miss Valentine arranged for some children to come visit him. 2 brothers close to Philip's own age who live on Murray Island. They came once, but while they were here Philip went into a rage, screaming and breaking things." "He was the one who bit my uncle's face," Rue guessed. Violet nodded. "Mr. Fanshawe is worried. We're all worried about his mental state. He's convinced himself of all kinds of odd things. It just seems best to keep the two of you apart for a while. We were going to tell him about you eventually, of course. We wanted him to get used to the idea before he met you." She paused, a little smile starting on her lips. "My mother thought that was foolish. She thought we should let you and Philip meet. She said 2 strong tempers are like a pair of waves coming at each other. Sometimes they smooth each other out." "Well, obviously that didn't work," Ruth said, dropping a thumb back at Philip's door. The shrieking had now changed over to wild sobs. "What did you say to him, anyway?" "Nothing," Rue insisted. "All I did was start to leave. He wanted me to stay." Violet laughed. "Well, maybe my mom was right after all. When I first met you, I thought you and your cousin were much of a muchness." When Rue scrunched up her face, Violet exclaimed, "It means you two are just the same. Both of you so proud and snappish." She rubbed her knuckles gently against Rue's chin. "What do you think? Can you stay out of trouble for the rest of the day?" Rue wasted no time. As soon as Violet went back upstairs to Philip, Rue went outside and walked the perimeter of the house until she came to the overgrown ivy that concealed the basement door. She glanced around quickly before she opened it a crack and slipped through. Once inside the garden, Rue went to work straight away, clearing more dead grass and leaves, adding to the pile in the corner. She strained and pulled at the roots till her hands were red and her shoulders ached. In the basement she found an old bucket caked with dried cement and took it outside to the river. There were many boats on the water today. The summer people had begun to arrive. Only a few weeks ago Rue would have admired the fearless way they plowed through the waves in their speedboats and jet skis, but now they seemed only careless and clumsy. She thought of Jack's silent approach in his canoe, the way he rode the river as easily as a loon. Glancing over at the island with the olive green house, she saw that there was now a boat docked by the pier. 4 candy-colored Adirondack chairs were set outside in front of the house. Jack would be long gone. She wouldn't get to see him again before she left. It bothered her to think about that. Would he wonder what had happened to her? Pretty soon she'd be back at the Burroughs' house. She thought about the cramped room she would have to share with the other foster girls. When they saw her, they would know that she had been tossed out of her uncle's house. They would love that. Rue felt her face heat up and her muscles tighten. The tinny voice of an approaching tour boat spliced into her thoughts. At a time when it was thought fresh, cold air could help in the treatment of tuberculosis. Unfortunately, the sanitarium killed more children than it healed. It finally closed its door in 1961 and the island is now privately owned. Rue quickly dragged the sides of the bucket on the bottom of the shallows, scooping up as much water as she could hold, then hauled the bucket back into the garden before the tour boat swung around the island into view. Back at the garden, she tipped the bucket and let the water spill out onto the soil, walking backwards. By the time the bucket was empty, only a narrow swath of earth had been dampened. It would take hours and hours to water the entire garden this way, and the soil was so dry that it drank up the water quickly and still needed more. It was futile, she knew, yet she kept at it, filling the bucket again and again and pouring it on the earth until every part of her body ached and the daylight began to dim. Violet would bring supper soon and would be looking for her. She should go back upstairs. Dropping on her hands and knees, she put her ear to the ground and listened. The silence lasted so long that she began to feel sick, worried that somehow she had done more harm than good. Then she heard it. The sound was as faint as before, but still there. She smiled with relief, but the very next moment she sat up in alarm. Something was in the garden with her. She had seen it move, just a quick flash in her peripheral vision, a shadow gliding up the slope towards the boulder. It had been too large and shaped all wrong to have been the black squirrel. Rue got to her feet and stared all around her. Nothing moved. The garden was perfectly still and so quiet she could hear her own breath. Yet she felt something was there with her, watching, the way she had watched the others from her own hiding places.